What would you do if your neighbor parked in your garage without asking? Not once, but twice. What if she stole your security code and acted like your property was hers to use freely? And when confronted, she tried to get you punished instead. This is the insane story of how Derek took down the most entitled HOA member ever. Trust me, you won't believe how it ends. Like and subscribe for more crazy stories. When Derek Johnson first moved into Maplewood Heights, he thought he had made the perfect choice. A quiet, well-maintained community, big sidewalks lined with trees, neatly trimmed lawns, and houses that all seemed to be pulled straight from a luxury real estate magazine. It was the kind of place where you imagined people waving as they walked their dogs or neighbors lending a cup of sugar when needed. For Derek, a black software developer who worked remotely, this place wasn't just a house. It was a fresh start. After years of renting apartments in noisy city neighborhoods, he finally had his own home, a space where he could focus on his projects without distractions. His house was one of the few in the neighborhood that had a converted garage turned into a home office, complete with large windows, the perfect setup for working from home. For the first few weeks, everything seemed peaceful. He met a few of his neighbors, exchanged polite nods and small talk, nothing too personal, but just enough to feel welcomed. That was until he met Karen Whitmore. It was a bright Saturday morning when Derek first saw her, a middle-aged white woman with short blonde hair, wearing a neatly pressed pastel blazer even though it was just a casual neighborhood. She carried a clipboard, and from the determined way she walked across his lawn, Derek knew she wasn't coming over for a friendly chat. She knocked twice, quick and sharp, and when Derek opened the door, she greeted him with a too-wide smile that somehow felt more like a smirk than a sign of warmth. "Hello, neighbor. I'm Karen Whitmore, your HOA representative. Welcome to Maplewood Heights." Her voice was high-pitched, sweet, and just dripping with condescension. Derek had encountered that tone before. It was the same one corporate managers used right before they told you weren't getting a raise. "Hi," Derek responded, keeping his tone neutral. "I just wanted to drop by and go over some of the community guidelines," Karen said, handing him a thick HOA pamphlet filled with rules about lawn maintenance, trash bin placements, mailbox aesthetics, and even the approved color palettes for exterior paint. Derek raised an eyebrow. "I read through most of this before I moved in, but thanks." Karen smiled tighter. "Oh, wonderful. Then you'll understand why I needed to stop by today." She flipped through her clipboard dramatically before tapping her pen against one of the pages. "I noticed your trash bins were still on the curb past the 7 a.m. pickup deadline yesterday." Derek blinked. "I took them in at 7:30. Karen tilted her head. "Yes, and that's 30 minutes later than the guidelines state." Derek stared at her, waiting for the punchline. Surely she wasn't serious. "I'll let it slide this time," she said with a slight chuckle, "but let's try to be more mindful. It keeps the neighborhood looking pristine." Derek bit back the urge to roll his eyes. He had lived here for less than a month, and already, it was clear that Karen was one of those people, the kind who got off on enforcing ridiculous rules just because they could. At first, Derek brushed it off. Every neighborhood had someone like Karen, right? But the complaints didn't stop. Over the next couple of weeks, he found HOA violation notices in his mailbox almost every other day. His mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Apparently, there was an approved shade. His succulents on the porch weren't within the permitted flora list. His wind chime was too loud, even though it barely made a sound unless there was a strong breeze. Each notice came with an official warning, but what really got under Derek's skin was the personal messages Karen left. She'd show up at his doorstep, always standing just a little too close, with that same smug smile plastered on her face. "Derek, honey, we all have to follow the rules. It's what keeps our property values high. You understand, don't you?" It was the way she said honey that made Derek grit his teeth. It wasn't friendly. It was patronizing, as if she was explaining something to a child. Derek did his best to comply with the minor requests, not because he respected Karen, but because he wanted her to leave him alone. He repainted his mailbox, moved his succulents to the backyard, even repositioned his wind chime farther from the street. But no matter what he did, Karen always found something else. One evening, Derek was taking a package inside when he noticed Karen standing at the end of his driveway, arms crossed, watching him. "Everything okay?" he asked. Karen gave an exaggerated sigh. "Amazon deliveries left out too long can make the neighborhood look unkempt." Derek glanced at the package in his hands. "Karen, it's been here for less than an hour." She smiled, but there was something sharp behind it. Just a friendly reminder. You wouldn't want people thinking the house was unattended, would you? There it was, the thinly veiled threat. Derek wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what she was implying. A black man in a wealthy neighborhood. If he didn't keep up appearances, people might start assuming things. That was the moment Derek stopped seeing Karen as just an annoying HOA rep. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was targeting him. Derek tried to ignore her after that, limiting conversations to one-word answers and staying out of her way. But Karen, she wasn't done. It was almost like she enjoyed the conflict, like it gave her some twisted sense of control. And sure enough, it wasn't long before she escalated her behavior. Derek had no idea what was coming. But Karen was about to cross a line so bold, so completely outrageous that Derek would no longer be able to ignore her. And when that happened, she was going to wish she had just left him alone. Derek was in the middle of an important video conference when the first blast of car horns shattered his concentration. At first, he tried to ignore it, assuming some impatient driver was just being obnoxious. But when the honking didn't stop, and instead grew louder and more persistent, he knew something was off. 5 minutes. Who in their right mind sits there honking for 5 straight minutes? With a deep sigh, Derek muted his mic and excused himself from the meeting. He grabbed an umbrella, knowing the storm outside was coming down in sheets, and headed toward the front door. The second he stepped onto his porch, he froze. There, parked directly under his carport, was Karen Whitmore's pristine white Mercedes. She sat behind the wheel, one perfectly manicured hand still pressing the horn, her eyes locked on him through the windshield like she was summoning a butler instead of inconveniencing an actual homeowner. Derek couldn't believe what he was seeing. The audacity, the absolute gall. "Karen." He called over the sound of the rain, making his way toward her. Finally, she stopped honking and rolled her window down just enough so the rain wouldn't touch her precious leather interior. "Derek, I need you to move your car." Derek frowned. "What?" Karen sighed dramatically, as if she were explaining something obvious to a child. "The street in front of my house is flooded, and I didn't want my car to get water damage. Your carport was empty, so I parked here. It's just temporary." Derek took a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the umbrella handle. He looked past her toward the street. Yeah, there were some puddles, but nothing extreme. The drainage system in Maplewood Heights was decent, and it wasn't like she drove a low-sitting sedan. She had a Mercedes SUV, for God's sake. And even if the street was flooding, that didn't mean she could just claim someone else's property. "Karen, you can't park here," Derek said, his voice calm but firm. "This is my carport." Karen gave an exaggerated eye roll, like he was the one being difficult. "Well, I would have knocked, but it's raining and I assumed you wouldn't mind." Derek blinked. "That's not how this works. You don't just assume you can take someone's property without asking first. Karen waved a dismissive hand. Oh, come on, Derek. It's just for a little while. You weren't even using the space. Derek shook his head. Doesn't matter, it's my property. You need to move your car. Karen's pleasant facade cracked just slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Then she tilted her head and gave him a too-sweet smile. Okay, fine. Since you're already out here, can you just open your garage instead? The rain is blowing into the carport, and I don't want my car getting wet from the side. Derek actually laughed out loud. You want me to move my car out of my own garage so you can park inside? Karen nodded, as if this was the most reasonable request in the world. Well, yes. My situation is more urgent, don't you think? Derek just stared at her, processing the sheer entitlement radiating from this woman. Finally, he said what should have been painfully obvious. No, Karen. I'm not moving my car. This is my property, and I need you to leave now. For a full 30 seconds, Karen glared at him through the rain, her eyes narrowed with a mix of frustration and disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend that someone had the audacity to tell her no. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, she shifted her car into reverse. Fine, but I'll be speaking to the HOA about this. And just like that, she sped off, deliberately plowing through a puddle so that a wave of muddy water splashed directly onto Derek's shoes and pants. Derek stood there, watching her car disappear around the corner, feeling a mix of rage and absolute disbelief. That night, Derek received an email from the HOA. The subject line alone made him groan. Proposed amendment for community emergency vehicle accommodations. Karen had wasted no time filing a formal complaint and was now trying to change the HOA rules to force homeowners to share their parking spaces during weather-related emergencies. Derek read through the email, his annoyance turning into a full-body irritation. This woman was something else. He immediately forwarded the email to a lawyer friend who responded almost instantly. They can't force you to allow other people to park on your property. This is ridiculous. His friend helped him draft a formal response, not just to Karen, but to the entire HOA board, making it clear that he would not be bullied into compliance. Derek hoped that would be the end of it, but he should have known better. Because Karen wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. And the next time she pulled one of her stunts, it wasn't just going to be a carport dispute. She was about to break into his garage, and this time, Derek wouldn't let it slide. For the next few days after the parking fiasco, Derek tried to move on. He figured that Karen had gotten the message. This was his property, not some HOA-controlled communal space. But Derek had underestimated Karen's level of entitlement, and he was about to find out just how far she was willing to go. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Derek had just finished running errands. His car trunk was full of groceries. The rain from earlier that week had finally cleared up, and all he wanted to do was unwind, cook a nice meal, and maybe watch a game. But the moment he pulled into his driveway, his heart stopped cold. Sitting inside his garage, his actual enclosed garage, not the carport, was Karen Whitmore's white Mercedes. For a solid 10 seconds, Derek just stared. What the hell? The garage door had been left open, almost like Karen was so confident in her actions that she hadn't even bothered to hide what she'd done. Derek parked his car, got out slowly, and took a few cautious steps forward, half expecting Karen to jump out and explain herself. But she was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a note was taped to the interior garage door leading into his house. Derek ripped it off and read, "Derek, I had an emergency HOA meeting and my street is under construction. I borrowed your garage. Thanks, Karen." Derek blinked. Then blinked again. She borrowed his garage, like it was some kind of community storage unit. Derek stood there for a long moment, processing the level of insanity he was dealing with. How had she even gotten in? Then it hit him. The last HOA inspection. A few months ago, Karen had requested access to his garage, claiming she needed to check the visibility of external wiring. Since she was on the HOA board, Derek, like a fool, had temporarily given her the exterior keypad code so she could get inside. He had never changed it after that. That meant that Karen had saved the code, or memorized it, and had just helped herself to his garage whenever she felt like it. Derek felt his blood pressure spike. This wasn't just an annoying HOA member pushing boundaries anymore. This was blatant trespassing. This was a violation of his home, his privacy, his security, and Derek wasn't going to let it slide. Within minutes, Derek took action. Step 1. Change the garage keypad code immediately. Step 2. Disable the manual override inside the house, so even if Karen tried using the keypad, she wouldn't be able to override it. Step 3. Ensure the security cameras were recording everything. Once that was done, Derek pulled out his phone and sent a very simple, very direct text. "You parked in my garage without permission. The code has been changed. Call me when you're ready to discuss this violation." And then he waited. 3 hours later, his phone started blowing up. "Karen, Derek, I need my car. Open the garage. Karen, this is ridiculous. You knew I was using it. Karen, why aren't you answering? Karen, you are being extremely unreasonable right now." Derek watched each message come in, leaning back on his couch with a satisfied smirk. She wasn't used to not getting her way. She thought she was still in control. But Derek. He was done playing nice. Finally, after letting her sweat for 15 more minutes, he replied, "Derek, I'm in a meeting. I'll be available in an hour." He knew that would drive her insane. And sure enough, 10 minutes later, his doorbell started ringing nonstop. Derek pulled up his security camera feed. Karen was standing at his front door, furiously pressing the bell, phone in hand, her face flushed red with frustration. She was pacing back and forth, talking animatedly on the phone, clearly telling someone all about how unreasonable he was being. Derek sighed, counted to 30, and then, finally, opened the door. "Karen." He greeted her with a perfectly neutral tone. She immediately launched into a tirade. "Derek, this is completely unacceptable. You locked my car inside your garage. I've been waiting for over an hour. I have an important appointment. You're holding my vehicle hostage." Derek leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, completely unimpressed. "Let me get this straight. You entered my garage without permission. Used a security code I gave you for a one-time HOA inspection. Parked your car inside my private property. And now you're mad that you can't get it back." Karen's eyes narrowed dangerously. "It was an emergency," she snapped. "My street is under construction." Derek didn't even flinch. "That's not an emergency. That's scheduled maintenance you knew about in advance. You could have parked somewhere else. You could have asked. But instead, you helped yourself to my garage like you owned it." Karen crossed her arms tightly, gritting her teeth so hard Derek was surprised they didn't crack. "You're blowing this way out of proportion." Derek chuckled. "No, Karen, I'm setting boundaries, and you're mad because you don't like hearing no." A muscle twitched in Karen's jaw. For a moment, Derek thought she was actually going to explode right there on his porch. Finally, through clenched teeth, she spat out, "Fine. I should have asked before using your garage." Derek raised an eyebrow and, Karen's nostrils flared, "And it won't happen again." Derek nodded. "Good, because if it does, I'll report you for trespassing." Karen's face turned a shade of red that probably wasn't healthy. She snatched her phone out, scrolled quickly, and deleted the old code from her notes app while showing him the screen. Derek, satisfied, finally pulled out his phone and unlocked the garage door remotely. As the door lifted, Karen stormed past him without another word, got into her car, and peeled out of the driveway so fast her tires screeched against the pavement. Derek watched her go, shaking his head. This wasn't over. Karen had just been checked for the first time in a long time, and people like her, they never let things go. Something told Derek she was already thinking of a new way to retaliate, and he'd be ready for it. Derek woke up the next morning feeling good. After the showdown with Karen the night before, he figured she'd finally gotten the message: stay off his property, keep her car out of his garage, and for the love of everything, stop acting like she owned the damn neighborhood. But Derek had underestimated Karen once again, because she wasn't the kind of person to admit defeat. And when Derek checked his mail later that morning, he found proof of that fact staring back at him. The envelope looked official, with the HOA's name printed at the top. Derek sighed, already knowing this wasn't going to be good. Inside was a letter from the HOA, demanding that he restore his garage back to its original state as a parking space within the next 30 days. The reasoning: apparently, his converted home office was now deemed non-compliant with current neighborhood regulations. Derek couldn't believe the audacity. He had permits for the conversion. The previous owners had permits for the conversion, and in the 3 years he had lived there, the HOA had never raised a single issue about it. Until now. Derek immediately knew who was behind this. Karen. She was furious about what happened and was now trying to use HOA rules to punish him. But what Karen didn't count on was that Derek wasn't going to just roll over and take it. Derek didn't even hesitate. He called his lawyer. They're retaliating, he told her, reading through the letter. They never had a problem with my garage before. This is pure harassment. His lawyer agreed immediately. They can't enforce a new rule retroactively. If your conversion was legally permitted, they have no case. Within hours, Derek had a formal legal response drafted and sent to the HOA board. It cited legal precedents about retroactive enforcement. It warned of potential lawsuits if the HOA continued its targeted harassment. And most importantly, it put them on notice. Derek was prepared to fight back. Karen might have thought she could bully him into submission through HOA technicalities, but she just declared war against the wrong person. That evening, Derek was just finishing dinner when his phone buzzed. Security camera notification. He pulled up the feed and froze. Karen's Mercedes was back in his garage. Again. Derek stared at the screen, feeling his anger bubbling up. She had done it again, even after everything, even after last night's confrontation, even after being explicitly told to stay the hell out of his property. And this time, she didn't even leave a note. She just parked inside like she owned the place and left. Derek clenched his jaw. Karen thought she could outplay him. But what she didn't know, Derek had one final move left, and she wasn't going to like it. Derek grabbed his keys, headed to his garage, and locked it from the inside. This wasn't just the usual keypad lock. He installed a heavy-duty padlock on the interior of the garage door. Once that was done, Derek stepped back, arms crossed, satisfied with his work. Karen wanted to use his garage like her personal parking space. Fine. But now, her car was officially locked inside, and Derek, he wasn't in any rush to let it out. At exactly 9:45 p.m., Derek's doorbell started going off like a fire alarm. He didn't even need to check the camera. He already knew who it was. Still, for his own entertainment, he pulled up the feed. Karen was fuming. She was pressing the doorbell over and over, her face red, her phone clutched in one hand, her mouth moving at full speed. Derek let her stew for a bit, enjoying his coffee while she ranted and raved outside. Then, after a solid 5 minutes, he finally opened the door. Karen! He greeted her calmly, as if she hadn't just been practically breaking his doorbell. Derek! She snapped, her voice practically a shriek. This is insane. You locked my car inside your garage. Derek nodded. I sure did. Karen's eye twitched. That's illegal. You're holding my car hostage. Derek let out a slow chuckle. Oh, Karen, you of all people should know about property rights, shouldn't you? Karen's nostrils flared. This is ridiculous. Open the garage right now. Derek crossed his arms, completely unfazed. Karen, you've repeatedly violated my privacy. You entered my property without permission. You used an access code that was never meant for you. You've ignored my boundaries, even after I confronted you about it. He let that sink in before finishing. So, no, I will not open the garage right now. Karen looked like she was going to combust on the spot. You can't do this, she shrieked. I'll call the police, Derek shrugged. Go ahead, Karen froze. That wasn't the reaction she was expecting. Derek tilted his head. You do realize I have security footage of you trespassing, right? Karen paled. You entered my property without permission twice. The police will be very interested in that. In fact, I'd love to show them the footage. Karen's face went through at least 3 shades of red before settling into a furious pink. She knew she was cornered. There was no way she could spin this without incriminating herself. After a long, tense silence, she exhaled sharply. When will you open the garage? Derek checked his watch. 9 a.m. tomorrow. Karen almost choked. Tomorrow, Derek nodded. That's right. I'll be asleep soon. And since you didn't feel the need to ask before using my garage, I don't feel the need to rush to let you out. Karen looked absolutely murderous, but she knew she had no leverage. With a final death glare, she spun on her heel and stormed off, her heels clicking furiously against the pavement. Derek watched her go, a satisfied smirk on his face. Karen had spent the last few weeks bullying him, trying to control him, invading his privacy. But now, she just learned an important lesson. And Derek, he had won this round. Derek had been expecting Karen to retaliate. Even after he locked her car in his garage overnight, even after she had to come back the next morning, humiliated and fuming, Derek knew someone like Karen wouldn't just let it go. And sure enough, by the time he checked his email later that day, there it was, an official notice from the HOA. Emergency HOA meeting scheduled property use and parking violations. The meeting was set for the following evening, and Derek didn't need to guess who was behind it. Karen had gone full nuclear. Derek arrived at the HOA meeting 5 minutes early, not alone, but with his lawyer by his side. When Karen saw them walk in together, her smug expression faltered just slightly. Derek resisted the urge to smirk. She had expected him to show up defenseless, maybe ready to apologize or plead his case. Instead, he had come fully prepared for war. The meeting room was packed, more homeowners than Derek had ever seen at a HOA meeting before. Word had clearly spread that something was going down. At the front of the room sat the HOA board, a group of 5 people, including Karen herself. Howard Johnson, one of the more level-headed board members, gave a polite nod to Derek as he sat down. Karen, however, didn't even look at him. Instead, she launched straight into her speech. Fellow homeowners, she began, voice oozing with faux professionalism. We are here today to discuss a growing issue in our community, a resident who refuses to comply with HOA regulations and is creating an unsafe, hostile environment. Derek almost laughed. This woman was actually trying to spin this like he was the problem. Karen continued, her voice getting louder and more dramatic with every sentence. We have had repeated incidents of rule breaking, inappropriate conduct, and refusal to cooperate with reasonable community standards. I have personally witnessed aggressive and obstructive behavior that threatens the harmony of our neighborhood. Derek's lawyer leaned over and whispered, Wow, she's really laying it on thick. Derek smirked. Just wait. Karen took a deep breath, as if preparing for the final blow. This is why I am formally proposing sanctions against Mr. Derek Johnson. including the immediate enforcement of HOA regulations regarding unauthorized property modifications and a community-wide vote on penalties for repeated noncompliance. She looked around the room, clearly expecting nods of agreement. Instead, silence. An awkward, tension-filled silence. Karen frowned, confused. That's when Howard cleared his throat. "Before we move forward with this discussion," he said, voice calm but firm, "I'd like to hear from Mr. Johnson." Karen's face twitched, but she didn't argue. Derek stood up. And then, he tore her case apart. Derek didn't need to raise his voice or be dramatic. All he had to do was lay out the facts. "I find it interesting," he began, "that Karen is accusing me of violating property regulations when my home office conversion was fully permitted before I even moved in. It has been compliant for 3 years without issue. Yet suddenly, after a personal disagreement, I receive a demand to revert it." A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Karen's smile looked a little more forced. Derek turned to the room. "What's even more concerning," he continued, "is that I have had multiple instances where Karen has entered my property without permission. I have security footage of her using a garage code she was never authorized to keep and parking in my garage, twice, without consent." A murmur spread through the room. Karen opened her mouth to interrupt, but Derek held up a hand. "I'm not done." Karen shut her mouth. Derek pulled out a folder and held it up. "Inside this folder is my legal response to the HOA, outlining clear retaliation and harassment against me. My lawyer is prepared to move forward with legal action if this behavior continues." The room went dead silent. Karen looked like she was about to explode, and then, the best part happened. A woman from the crowd raised her hand. "I have something to say." Karen immediately tried to cut in. "This is not—" "Let her talk," Howard interjected. The woman stood up. "Karen, I live 2 doors down from you, and I have had enough of your selective enforcement. 3 months ago, I got a notice for a non-regulation flower bed. Meanwhile, your friend Linda has a garden twice the size of mine, and you never said a word about it." Karen's face turned pale. And then, another voice. "Yeah. And why is it that every time a new family moves in, the first thing they get is a complaint from you?" A few nods. Then, from the back, "Karen sent me 3 separate notices for my Christmas lights last year." 3. But somehow, when her friends decorate early, it's festive. At this point, Karen looked completely cornered. Derek didn't even need to say anything anymore, because the neighborhood had turned on her, and the HOA board, they noticed. Howard turned to Karen. "Karen, it's clear that this discussion has shifted beyond just Mr. Johnson. There are multiple reports of selective enforcement and unfair HOA practices under your leadership." Karen tried to compose herself. "This isn't about me. This is about—" "Actually, Karen," Howard cut in, "it is about you." Karen froze. The HOA board members exchanged looks. Then Howard made it official. "Effective immediately, we are calling for a vote to remove Karen Whitmore from her position on the HOA board." Karen gasped. "What? You can't." "All in favor," Howard said loudly. 4 hands went up. Karen's didn't. She looked around in horror, realizing, too late, that she had lost. 3 weeks later, Derek watched from his porch as a moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. She was selling her home and leaving the neighborhood. On the morning she left, Derek saw her one last time as she walked to her car. Their eyes met across the street. Derek gave her a slow, satisfied wave. "Karen." She scowled, yanked open the door of her white Mercedes, and drove off. But not before Derek caught one last glimpse of her custom vanity plate. "Karen time," Derek laughed to himself. "Not anymore, Karen. Not anymore."